These days, when we see news headlines flooded with information, data, numbers, how do we decide what's important and what's not? How do we figure out what is actually true and indicates how the economy is doing, and what's kind of just fluff? So I'm very excited to introduce my two esteemed panelists. We've got Austan Goolsbee, he's the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, and John Clifton, who's the CEO of Gallup. And as you guys may have seen, Gallup, oh, well, I was hoping the logo would be right up there, is sponsoring part of the Aspen Ideas Festival. So I'll give you guys both 30 seconds. Give me your best elevator pitch of what you do and why it matters to the session today.
Okay, I was on the faculty at the University of Chicago for 30 years. Yeah,
Go Maroons.
And 2.5 years ago, I moved over to the Chicago Fed. Chicago Fed sits on the Federal Open Market Committee, where they decide every 6 weeks on the interest rate. You may have seen it. Jay Powell is the chair. And the data matters a lot to us. The law of the Federal Reserve Act says that the FOMC is supposed to maximize employment and stabilize prices, and that's all of what we're supposed to look at, and only what we're supposed to look at, which are hard numbers based. It bleeds into the sentiment, and it bleeds into the quality of the data, and that's why it's super important what Gallup does, what other people that influence the economy do, and the quality of the numbers. Otherwise, we're flying blind.
Nice. John?
Vivian, it's great to be here. Many of you may know Gallup as an organization that studies politics, but actually more broadly, we are a people analytics firm. And around the world, we collect a great deal of data and do analytics, largely on the emotional economy, but kind of any aspect of data that's necessary. So I think a lot of people may not be familiar with the fact that when you look at the SDGs, of that really long list of indicators that they use to measure progress on the 17 SDGs, Gallup actually works with the World Bank, FAO, and ILO to produce officially 3 of them. So we help countries around the world, international organizations, to help understand what is it that people are thinking and feeling and doing within their organizations. And secondly, speaking of organizations, we also do people analytics for organizations and companies. And lastly, we do it for individuals. So many of you have probably gone through a thing called StrengthsFinder. That's something to kind of decode what makes somebody amazing. 500,000 freshmen go through it every single year in the United States. But it's actually something that Gallup has been doing, and we've been blessed with the fact that now 35 million people have gone through it. So that's everything about Gallup in a nutshell.
I love it. So we're going to start off with a absolute softball. Kidding, of course not. Let's talk about the disconnect. Earlier, Rhett asked, how many of you feel like the American economy is doing really well? And some of the numbers, certainly on headlines, say that it is. But there are many folks who are now headed to the grocery store and realizing that the cost of living is vastly outpacing what they're able to make. So the feeling and the numbers don't necessarily tell the same story. So what explains this disconnect between traditional economic indicators versus public sentiment?
Go ahead. You're the expert on opinions. Yeah, what is it?
I mean, look, right, that I think there was an article in The Economist about a year ago where on the cover it said something about the amazing American economy. And that probably didn't resonate very well with a lot of Americans. And the reason I say that is that we've been tracking sentiment in the United States on how they feel about their own personal finances. And we just saw the highest percentage this year of people that say that their personal finances are getting worse. Now again, just to contextualize it, I'm going to point out the obvious, but that 53% that say that it's getting worse is a higher percentage than after the 2008 global crisis, and also a higher percentage than 2020. Now in absolute terms, it's not the worst. We see about 20% of people who, when they grade their own personal finances, say that they think it's poor. The worst possible on the scale that's available. So, Vivian, I think you're right to question that when we see that there's sort of this triumph of success on the American economy, yet Americans aren't feeling it, why the disconnect?
And then a quick follow-up question for Austin is, how does your organization actually kind of bridge that gap? You've got folks who are like, please lower mortgage rates, please make it easier and cheaper to borrow, and your team helps determine that.
Yeah, okay, there's
Yeah.
two parts.
Yeah,
I don't
get in
want to, they are connected. Now, don't blame us for your mortgage rates. You know, almost all mortgages are 30-year fixed mortgages, so the long interest rate, 30-year rates are what matters. Fed doesn't set that. We set overnight rates. They influence
The bank borrowing
them.
rate.
I told you, the Federal Reserve Act says we are supposed to look at the actual hard numbers. And we went through a few years here where that's called the dual mandate, the price stability and maximum employment. Dual mandate grounds wasn't looking too bad. The numbers are looking pretty decent. The unemployment rate at or around 4% and kind of stable full employment. Inflation got way too high, but has been coming down in 2023. That was among the biggest drops in the inflation rate that we've ever had, and the only one that we ever had that did not come with a nasty recession to do it. At the same time, you're picking up in the Michigan Consumer Confidence Survey, you're picking up in opinion surveys, people saying, no, the economy stinks. So, we try to figure out why. We can't really figure out why they feel that way. But we always cared about the vibes because they were an indicator, a forecaster of how people's spending was going to behave. And so if you cared about the actual numbers, it was a bit of a leading indicator to look at the vibes. And if people said, I think the economy stinks, that would be a forecast that in the next 6 months their spending is going to go way down. The usefulness of the University of Michigan survey on consumer sentiment as a forecast variable for what consumer spending is going to do has been slowly breaking down for the last 15 years. It's gotten extreme in the last 3 or 4 years, but if you just take that, and whenever you make a forecast, you're going to use the hard data. If you then ask, how much better does the forecast get on top of the hard data if you add sentiment? It used to be modestly better, then it was not much better, and in the last 4 years, it's actually been worse. If you add sentiment, it makes the forecast worse, and I think that's just a econometric way to say people are saying, have been saying for multiple years, this is the worst economy, worse than 2008, 9, 10, and then the actual numbers have not been worse. So that makes me a little more hesitant to take it as a leading indicator, but it's just made it more confusing. It's added to the uncertainty. There's already uncertainty about policy. There's already uncertainty about geopolitics. And now there's uncertainty of you can't even really tell what's happening. And that's made the job harder.
Yeah, and that leads me perfectly into the next question. Obviously, John mentioned how important some of those sentiment analysis are. Austin, you mentioned that some of the vibes actually then can eventually be a leading indicator for numbers. Do you guys think that our current metrics, things like GDP, CPI, unemployment rate, that they're actually still the best ways to understand economic well-being, or what are the new metrics we need to make?
They are still the best ways. They're still the best. I would say the official data, they are, but they've gotten worse. So there's nothing better, but they're not great. They've gotten to be less accurate. I would say that the official statistics are the gold standard worldwide, but in my world, that's the worst thing it can be. So you don't want a gold standard. You want something totally reliable. And I'll just give an example of the tentpole number for the job market has always been the monthly job growth. And you see, if you turn on CNBC on the first Friday of the month, they have the countdown, and they're like, they're going to tell us how many jobs it was.
And you're talking non-farm payroll.
Non-farm payroll, that was kind of your tentpole. If I said, what's one number that's a good summary of the labor market, you'd either say the unemployment rate or the non-farm payroll total number of jobs. Okay, we believed that the break even, we call it the break even rate. What's the level of job creation for the month that indicates whether we're heating up or cooling down? The break even was about 85,000, our folks thought. People could vary 80,000, 100,000 a month. In 2024, we're getting like 150,000, 180,000 a month after month, which at first people are saying, uh-oh, inflation must be about to kick in because we're double the break even. Then we come to the end of the year and come to find out there was a massive amount of immigration that we didn't detect, and that was going into the number. And the amount of the rise of gig work wasn't getting counted specifically into the number because they weren't yet showing up as tax-paying companies, which is where the payroll survey is done. And so then they said, well, maybe the break even is 180,000 a month, not 80,000 a month. And now immigration has slowed back down, and this is just a way, it's still the best number we have. The unemployment rate and the non-farm payrolls are the best numbers. They've just gotten far noisier and far less accurate. And again, it's emphasized, try to get a portfolio of as much as you can. They asked me, are you a hawk or a dove? And I said, I only ever aspired to be one of the data dogs, of which there are many at the Fed. And one of the first rules of the data dogs is don't be choosy about what falls on the floor. Just sniff everything.
Everything.
And I think on the data side, that's where we are.
John, do you agree?
What was the original question?
If you felt like numbers like GDP, CPI, like the hard numbers that we currently rely on, are they still the best, or is there something else that you guys are looking at that we should be looking at?
That's the way you worded that is interesting. I don't think we should necessarily, if there are other indicators available, that we have to sort of damn existing indicators in the first place. The reason I say that is if we look back to, let's take the father of GDP, for example, Simon Kuznets. I think it was 1934 when he went to Congress and said, hey, we ought to have a metric that would appraise the economy or tell us whether or not it's growing or contracting. He also said, but remember, don't use this to understand, whether or not a nation is prosperous or measure it for the welfare of the nation. And I think he's right, because I think for a lot of times we start to use that to say, is the country going well in other aspects of just sort of wealth? So we took a shot at it 20 years ago, and we said, you know what, in the same spirit of Simon Kuznets, if he's going to recommend that we create a metric for how the economy is going, what if we create a metric for how people's lives are going? And so in 140 countries, including the United States, by the way, in still 100 countries, we knock on people's doors. I know that sounds insane, but remember, there are many people that still don't have a phone or access to the internet in order to be able to have just a conversation with them and say, how's your life going? I think there are some people that ridiculed us for this work too, and said, can you really understand how somebody's life is going? Which I guess I would say I find a bit elitist. Usually when you ask somebody how their life is going, if there's anything that they are an expert on, it's how their life is going. And I think what's even more remarkable is how these indicators tie to real world events. Many of you are probably familiar with the World Happiness Report. That's actually what I'm referencing. So they use Gallup's data in 140 countries. They label it happiness, even though happiness has two definitions. One has to do with this sort of ephemeral, fleeting emotion. The other one has to do with contentment. It's probably more contentment that we're measuring, but when you see this sort of widespread discontentment, you can see in places before the Arab uprising, you saw in Egypt and Tunisia, a crash with how people rated their lives. When you looked before the Brexit vote, we were tracking how people rated their lives. You saw a crash in terms of people felt about their own lives. And actually in the past 4 years, we saw a near 10 decline in what we call people are thriving, how they rate their lives on a scale of 0 to 10 today, and where they think it'll be in the next 5 years. So again, I don't think we need to disparage existing indicators. I mean, many of these indicators that have been created aside from unemployment, you can ask me about that. I have issues with that. But many of them are very useful, but they're not when they're used for the wrong purposes. And I think when we create some of these other indicators, they can be more useful to leaders to understand, are we actually making real progress in terms of how people's lives are going?
You can't make that statement and then not feel like I'm about to ask you about it. Can I get a 30-second breakdown of why you hate the unemployment stat?
Okay, did I say hate? Maybe I did.
Said
maybe
concerns.
Concerns, yeah.
I'll tell you why I have concerns about it. Because it would appear that unemployment is more of a rich world indicator. A lot of people, when they talk about hard data and soft data, they say soft data in a bit of a disparaging way, and I think they take a shot at us and they call us pollsters. And I say to them, what hard data do you trust? And they go, I trust hard data like unemployment. And I go, how is that measured? I don't know why. They always want to know how we measure things, but they've never asked how unemployment is measured. Of course, it's a survey. The Bureau of Labor Statistics interviews 60,000 people. It's a household survey, and they go, do you have a job? It takes them an hour and a half to do it. But one of the great challenges is that, when ILO rounds up its data and it finds globally that about 5 to 6% of people are unemployed globally, which on its face is rather shocking. Because think about the rich countries that have higher unemployment rates. That in poorer countries, there would be an indicator that's so much lower. So why is that? It has to do with one thing. When those interviews are being done and they ask, did you work 30 or more hours in the past week? Did you work for an employer? The way that they categorize self-employed is where the problem is. So about 30% of the world says that they are self-employed, but half of that group lives on less than $2 a day. When we think of self-employment in the United States, we think of this very honorable, it's the next,
Like
great
me.
founder of it. Yeah, there you go. Or that they're going to start a business and open up a bar on the, in their hometown. For most of the world, that is not what self-employment means. It often means that they're begging, they're subsistence workers. And we just wrap all those indicators together. And if you just crudely took half that group that's living less than $2 a day and added it to that 5 to 6%, well, suddenly unemployment jumps to about 21%, which would be probably a far more accurate representation about what the real jobs picture is. So sorry, but you asked something that
In a way, even within the U.S., what is unemployment? You only count as unemployed if you're actively seeking work. If you drop out of the labor force, you don't count as unemployed. And some of the people that drop out of the labor force are retired or pulled out of the labor force, had a kid, and are not working. Those are kind of voluntary separation from the labor force. There are a bunch of people who are not in the labor force because they get to be discouraged workers. In recessions, the unemployment rate rises a lot, but the true unemployment rate rises even more because there are a bunch of people who say, I looked for a job for 6 months, I couldn't find it. I don't know what I'm gonna pull back from the labor force. And we've gone through an interesting period post-COVID in which maybe because there were more flexible work arrangements, maybe because people rethought what they were doing with their lives, you've seen a massive increase in labor force participation among a bunch of groups that previously had relatively low labor force participation, like self-described, do you have a disability? Labor force participation of people who say, I have a disability, is extremely low. It's gone up like 400%. It's by far the highest it's ever been. Women, highest labor force participation for each age group that it has ever been. Overall labor force participation down because the population is aging and we have more retirees. All of this plays into, is the unemployment rate right now, if it's 4.2%, does it mean the same thing that an unemployment rate of 4.2% meant in 1956? Maybe, maybe not. I mean, it was such a different labor force. So again, I do think you want to look at as many different indicators as you can, like quit rates, hiring rates. The job market is not one thing. And kind of the premise behind what John's saying is to be unemployed or to be employed, we treat that as if that's one state, to be employed. There are zillions of different kinds of jobs, and to be self-employed is different than to be employed at a big firm, to be employed at a small firm. And we're now, it feels like, at this moment in a weird economy where the quit rates are low and the hiring rates are low. And anybody who's got a college-age kid knows it's really hard to find a job coming out of college right now. And that hasn't been true for quite a long time.
Yeah.
And that's especially true in tech, which it hasn't been true for a long time. And yet, if you go out, like if I go out in the 7th District, heart of the Midwest, we got a lot of manufacturing, highest manufacturing intensity of all the districts. They're like, we have a worker shortage. We can't find people to come work over here. And it's like, but what about all the college grads who they can't find a job? And they're like, well, those aren't the people that we're looking for. So some mismatch.
On that note, it seems like there's a pretty clear bifurcation between younger versus older generations, as well as transparently just folks who come from the top quartile of household incomes, perhaps generational wealth, versus the bottom quartile. The folks who are younger and from lower income communities are feeling even more pessimistic than just the broader average about their economic futures. But America has always been the country of the economic mobility, the American dream. Do you think that this newfound perception amongst Gen Z is justified, and what structural factors might be contributing?
Well, what you're describing is 100% real.
Yeah.
And, look, a lot of times there are young people, and we see this kind of in our trends throughout history, where young people are concerned about their job prospects, as they should be, right? I mean, they're entering the labor market, but we do see some heightened concerns right now. And I think one that's got them really concerned is something that they all use really well, which is AI. There's this great debate that's playing out, and I think it's got them really concerned, which is, where do I fit in the future of AI? Because, you have on one end the CEO of Anthropic that says you're going to see a 10% contraction in the entire labor market. That would scare the life out of me if I was just graduating. Then you have others that say, no, don't worry, this is, I think sometimes they might even incorrectly, talk about the hype cycle, but they'll say, no, don't worry, in the 1960s, 60% of all jobs that existed no longer exist today. And so don't worry, everything's going to be fine. But then, of course, others will ask, like Nicholas and Nassim Taleb told us to do, which is don't overmath everything. If we're going to have a black swan event that's actually going to take a shot that's to the tune of 10% on the labor market, what would it look like? Would it look like AI? So I think they're rightfully concerned. And again, right now you can see, at least in January and February, and correct me if I'm wrong, but we saw record layoffs that were taking place. Now, of course, there are other things. Executives are saying, well, those are tariff related. There's a fantastic Wall Street Journal article that said, no, actually, there's a new attitude in the C-suite where they're actually trying to do more with less. And so they're actually going around and just trying to find efficiencies and saying, we want to see managers and executives do more with less people because we think it's actually better. But the combination of all of that would worry them a great deal, and I don't blame them.
I guess my perspective is with AI, with tariffs, and with some other things, we have always known that what you see in the media influences how you feel about the economy. And that was true before there ever was the internet, before there was social media. You remember, I like to cite the example, if you're old enough, you remember the election of 1992. The whole presidential election was about the mismanagement of the recession. It's the economy stupid. George H.W. Bush wasn't managing recession. Go look at the data. There was no recession in 1992. The recession ended in 1991. 1992 is a perfectly fine year. But the incessant reading in the media that the economy stinks, we're in a recession. In the 1996 election, I wasn't there, but I talked to people who were in the campaign, and they said they debated, should President Clinton run on, yes, I know the economy still stinks, but it was George Bush's fault and we spent 4 years trying to fix it? Or should they say, no, the economy's pretty good? And they were back and forth, and then at the last, they said, no, we're going to say the economy was good. The economy, but like the mid-90s, was a booming, as big a boom as we've ever had, in 50, 100 years. The fact that in the vibes, what people were reading was still emphasizing that. There are some aspects that you can only see the true quality looking back. And it does make me a little nervous that in a world of social media where you can make your own newspaper, we get in these silos. You're making your own news. We're getting in silos where, and you'll see it in the consumer confidence numbers. It's another reason why the tie between the opinions and the harder data, it's valid to not call it hard. A lot of the hard data does come from surveys. Some of that we're no longer picking up actual economic facts. We're picking up people's politics or what they see in the paper. So I wasn't surprised that as the blasting of tariffs, the tariffs are coming, they're going to wipe out the world, the prices are going to go way up. In the sentiment, you saw consumer sentiment plunging. You saw their expectations of what the inflation rate was going to be skyrocketing, even greater than, it's worth remembering, at the end of the day, imported goods are 11% of GDP in the United States. Okay, so it's a sliver. I'm not saying it's unimportant, but mostly the U.S. economy is a domestic-driven economy. But the more we, in our silos, say things are going to get bad, the more we're going to see that reflected in the sentiment data.
Vivian, if you don't mind, it also makes a great point that, if you look and do a text analysis, we pulled it from columns of influential economists and then correlated it with attitudes about the economy. You can see that when people are reading things about the economy, yes, it's reflected there. And also things like consumer confidence, which is just asking people 2 questions: how do you feel about the state of the economy today? Where do you think it's going in the future? Respondents are also, it's a heavily politically charged item. I mean, attitudes flipped when Trump came into office. Republicans thought it was a disaster. Trump comes in, they think it's great. Democrats thought it was going well. Trump comes in, they go the opposite direction. That said, I don't know that that's always true about how they feel about their personal financial situation, because sometimes we use economic confidence, consumer confidence, as a proxy of whether or not people are going to spend. If I recall correctly, it was even early in the 1940s or 50s, there was qualitative evidence that showed that how people feel about the economy doesn't always impact how they spend. And so, Vivian, you asked a really good question about, are we using the right indicators or how we're using them? And I think one of the great challenges of inflation is how it was used in the past 4 years and what caused more frustration among Americans, and why I think it contributed to some of the collapse in trust that took place. When we talk about inflation, Americans don't feel that it went up 2%. What they feel is that there was a compounded increase over the past 5 years. And I think sometimes when they hear politicians or leaders say, aren't you thrilled? It's down at 1% now or 2%. I think they're saying no, because everything that I'm paying for is still brutally overpriced, and I haven't seen many of those increases in my income, and I'm still struggling. And I think that disconnect and that messaging also has political consequences. If you look on our site, and then this is very Gallup research of us. We buried this halfway through an article, even though it might have been the best finding. But every election, one of the questions that we asked, 2-part series actually, one is, what do you think the biggest problem is facing this country? And the second question that we ask is, what party do you think is best to handle it? Now, it has only been wrong once in predicting who is going to win the election. That was Dewey and Truman. It tied 2 other times, and I think we took a year off. But this year, Americans said their biggest problem was immigration and inflation. And they said it was Republicans that they thought were best to handle those particular issues. And it could be, again, attributable to how things were being communicated to say, hey, look, we're making these amazing gains based on an economic indicator, but they didn't feel those amazing gains with their paycheck and the things that they were buying on a regular basis.
Bless you. We had a really good kind of pivot away from just talking about data, but rather how data is received. I don't know if you guys all got to join a session a little bit earlier. Dean Withers, who is another content creator in the political space, mentioned that he tries to, convey the facts, even though fear-mongering and saying certain things that are clickbaity is better for business. Inherently, that is the entire business of news. News agencies make money by getting you to click, getting your desire to actually read the article, even pay to get past the paywall. So trust in media, in government, and sometimes even very reputable organizations has declined. So how do you think that people are now receiving that economic data, that information that they're getting, and is that potentially, in part, leading to this uprising or this increase in misinformation?
Does that mean I have to go first?
Yeah.
Look, trust in institutions have declined across the board for many institutions. We've been looking at 9 of them over the past 50 years, and we've seen declines in all 9. We added more, and they're still in decline. I mean, one that took the worst hit was mass media. I mean, Americans really don't trust media right now. Mm-hmm. Now, I think your question around what do we do maybe to fix it, and also attributable to data, because, at Gallup, we've had our own challenges in the past. And so how we respond matters. And so, there was a study that was done. I thought it was absolutely fascinating. And they looked at Fortune 500 companies, and they looked at when something really went wrong, like there was some sort of mistake. And then they would take, do a text analytics, whatever the case is, and they would bucket the executives into 2 things. One, when something went wrong, did they blame externalities, or did they look inside for some sort of change? Now, of course, then they tracked over time to see which companies then did better. And I think you probably know how this comes out, but those that looked inside for change actually performed better. I don't know, I was I was watching the White House Correspondents' Dinner. I thought there was a really amazing moment when a gentleman stood up, got an award, looked at all his colleagues and peers, and said, Americans are losing faith in us. What a moment that they're celebrating, who's had the most success that year, and he uses it as a time to say, guys, maybe we ought to pause and say that we aren't doing our jobs perfectly. And rather than blaming externalities, he said, maybe we all ought to look inside, and it's going to start with me. And I couldn't believe what a profound moment that someone would do that so publicly, and how inspirational for the rest of us to say, how do we look inside when something goes wrong? And I know, look at Gallup, a lot of times people remember the 2012 election with Obama and Romney. Not to blame externalities, but, we actually, our final thing said too close to call, but that's okay. We don't have to remember that. But you know what we did do? We looked inside, and we hired academics and said, look at anything you want and tell us how to get better. And then, of course, it's a really lengthy report that if you have trouble sleeping at night, I highly recommend you pick it up. But we used it as a moment to say we need to get better, because if we don't, people aren't going to trust us anymore. So I think in a lot of these institutions or indicators that exist, I think these are moments to say it's okay. But let's look inside to say, how is it that we ourselves can improve from whatever it is that's taken place?
On my side, at the beginning, when you asked the question, it almost sounded like not message advice, but a little bit marketing advice. And don't ever ask that guy with an econ PhD for message advice. I don't know. I do know that, as John said, the trust in all major institutions is way down. Everything, from business to government to religion to the military to the police to academic institutions, every single thing down. It's still the case that people like their local better than they do national. And people don't like elite. They don't like faceless, bureaucratic looking, and they don't generally like big business, big government, big anything. Maybe it can be rooted in that let's start with where trust still exists. We've gone through phases, pendulum swings. I bet Gallup could tell us when they were high and when they were low. For sure, when you had Vietnam, Watergate, and a series of things, trust in government collapsed. But then it can come back. It does feel like we're at a low point. When I first came into the Fed, I kind of opened to the 2,000 employees of Chicago Fed. And I said, look, people don't like the Fed. They don't like elite. They don't like big. They don't like Wall Street. They don't like banks. The Fed is like some combination of all of those things. In our approval rating, if you look at the polls, approval rating of the Fed, we're 5 points higher than the IRS. And then they were like, oh, you could hear them. And I was like, but that's double Congress, so it was, that's a good place to start, is our local, let's explain, we're not the bad guys. We're the guardians of the galaxy. We're the good guys. And your local reserve banks exist because in 1913, when they made the Federal Reserve System, just like today, people were deeply uneasy with the idea that Washington, D.C., plus Wall Street would control the entire financial system of the United States with no input from the rest of the country. That's why they created this. And that local, let's start with the local, let's start with rebuilding ourselves and do the best job we can. I kind of think that's the inspiring version, that it's not hopeless, but it's gotten harder over time because nobody answers their phone anymore. No, if you knock on their door, they're like, get off my lawn, and
I can see you on the Ring camera, please go away.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know you, please leave. That affects polling. That affects economic data.
By the way, but yeah.
It depends where you are.
Yeah.
So some places are more trustworthy than others.
Yeah, there are a lot of countries around the world that if you knock on the door, our response rates are 70, 80%.
Wow.
That's amazing.
In fact, you could argue mathematically that they're above 100% because sometimes, like in some communities, the tribal leader will come over and go, you can go ahead and knock on my door next. I have a few opinions I'd like to share with you. And so, there are some places where it's remarkable. People want to be heard.
That's fascinating. But this declining response rates make it in polling, a lot of what you're picking up in the polling when people criticize polling inaccuracy is just a sign that people that are retired, they might answer the phone, and young people, they don't answer the phone at all. And so then you got to rebalance the sample of what you got to try to match what you think is the aggregate. But once you're in the rebalancing, now what you're actually reporting is your model, not straight fact. And that happens in making the unemployment rate. That happens in all the official data too. They got to figure out how to make it nationally representative, and that's definitely hard.
Now that we are at roughly 12 minutes left of our session, I'd love to actually open it up to audience Q&A. We have mic runners, so please just wait until our runner comes to you, and so that way everybody in the room can hear your question.
Thanks so much. My name is Elizabeth Clay-Roy, and I work with young people. So my question is a little bit on going deeper on consumer confidence and anxiety for young people. I wonder how much of it is not necessarily the short-term fluctuations, but the long-term decline in economic mobility, and the fact that for so many young people, they're not just comparing their economic situation to what it was a year ago or a few months ago, but whether or not they'll be able to achieve their parents' level or exceed their parents' economic status. And for now, many Gen Zers and many millennials, that does not feel possible. And data indicates that for some of them, they're not on track to do that. So I'm really interested in perspectives, particularly on young people and how they're experiencing the economy, and this question of economic mobility.
It's kind of fascinating, and I would make 3 small points. One, I don't know why, but for some reason, reporting on the internet, people are in way worse moods on the internet. So the Michigan Consumer Sentiment Survey has recently moved to be 100% done on the internet. And you can see in the data, for whatever reason, when they're answering online, they're in a bad mood. So to the extent that the young people are only answering online, you got to scale that some way. The thing that's weird, if you go look at the data, and I hesitate to even bring it up, because if it looks, I'm not meaning to criticize Vibe's sentiment. If you look at the absolute level of wealth, corrected for inflation, of 25-year-olds or 30-year-olds today compared to their parents when they were 25 and 30 years old, it's actually well above what it was the equivalent. It's not higher than your parents are when they're 60, but it's higher than they were at a comparable point. And once you get into that, once you get to start thinking in that way, it sort of illustrates one of the problems is that over long periods of time, there are massive changes in the relative price of different things, which can be conflated into standard of living. But the most perfect example is housing, okay? House prices, before there ever was COVID, we went through a 10, 15-year period where inflation never got to 2%. But that wasn't because all the inflation of everything was 2%. Goods inflation was deflation, about minus 1% a year. And house price inflation was 3.5%, 4% a year. Every year for 20 years this has been happening. Okay, so that's a thing that was compounding, 5% a year for 20 years. You don't need to be the head of Gallup to figure out the relative price can be pretty different. So when young people look and they're like, my mom wasn't working. My dad had one job. He didn't go to college. He could afford a big house. I can't even afford a condo. And it feels like the American dream is dead. There is one heavy component, which is, yeah, but going to Target or Costco or buying a jacket or buying food or buying all of these things, flat screen TVs,
those are $200
are
now.
way, way, way cheaper relatively. And so we do have to kind of make that calibration. It seems like you don't agree, but it's okay if you don't.
No, I was just going to say quickly, I think, if we only focus on money, we may be missing another component where there's a study on UCLA. They don't use the word purpose, they use something else. But it would appear that with college freshmen, there is a decline in purpose that's taking place among young people. And I think it was Yuval Noah Harari that had brought this up, that one way that we judge to see if our life has been successful is, one is, did you monetarily or financially do better than your parents? But the other one has something to do with values. And I'm wondering, and maybe it's things like social media that could be compounding some of these effects, but what makes a great life? And it feels like there's a lot of consensus. It's how you see your life, it's how you live your life, but then there's an element of purpose that goes all the way back to, I'm going to say both words because I always get corrected, eudaimonia and eudaimonia. But the point is that if we're losing that, what are the consequences of it? And so I think it's something that we got to watch. We also see it in workplaces. We've seen almost a 10-point decline in people feeling like they're attached to the mission and purpose of the organization in which they work. And to be quite honest, that sucks. Going to work where you feel emotionally detached like that from being part of something takes a lot of the fun out of life.
And then we have the gentleman in the back.
My name is Bill Becker. I work in climate, so you can anticipate what I'm about to say. What attracted me to this session was the word transformation in the title. But we've been focusing on short-term indicators, by and large, except for John's mention of the happiness index. And we've got some long-term problems. And so when most of the people in the room said that they thought the economy was in good shape, I wonder if they were thinking about the fundamentals that are risking the health of the economy in the future. I'll give you one example. 80% of our economy is run on, or 80% of the fuels that run our economy are fossil fuels. They're finite, they cause pollution that makes people sick, and they're causing disruption in the climate that's increasing by the day because we keep polluting. We do not count any of that in the price we pay at the pump. It's also externalized, and according to the International Monetary Fund, we externalize the cost to the tune of $750 billion a year in environmental, health, damages, and the other production costs. So what I'm saying is there an indicator that can factor in risk, long-term risk to the economy in a way that consumers can see it coming, voters can see it coming, and they begin to appreciate the risk and take measures to mitigate it?
You hope so. I doubt, personally, I think that you're never going to find, if only we had this number, this solves all our problems. I think it's unrealistic to think that way. That's why I like that sniff any food that comes to the ground, go sniff it and see if it's edible. In the long run, your emphasis on, hey, shouldn't we have some indicators that are indicative of the long run, not just what does the unemployment rate fluctuation this month? Yes, super. Once you start thinking that way, you can't think about anything else. Productivity growth is sort of the only one that we have in that style now. And in the short run, it's very noisy, but over the long run, it's the most important thing for our standard of living. Incorporating other non-production, non-economic, currently declared economics. In a way, that's where John started, of Simon Kuznets, and this is not an indicator of our intelligence, there's a great quote from Robert Kennedy where he's like, the GDP measures everything except the beauty of our poetry, how good is our mathematics, the love of our children, something. He's like, in short, it measures everything except those things that make life worth living. We should think in that space. It's not easy, but we should think.
I would say, I don't even know if I'm answering your question correctly here, but if there are additional indicators that we could look at to understand where things are going, one would be, rather than measure the lowest common denominator that exists on jobs, which is unemployment, what if we had something like a Great Jobs Index? One that actually looked at things like, you've mentioned things like vibes, but whether or not people feel like they're attached to a purpose or feel like they're doing what they do best. I think that would be one. I think the other thing, though, is these indicators on mood are important for a few reasons. But so, for example, now we've been asking the world, the late Danny Kahneman helped us do this, if people are experiencing a lot of anger, stress, sadness, pain, and worry. For the first few years, we would see in countries, particularly war-torn countries, a lot in the Middle East, that they had high negative emotions. Other countries that were doing quite well had lower negative emotions. But then what started happening is what Danny Kahneman said in the year before he passed away, which was this could be one of the biggest trends, as big as the Easterlin paradox, which is we saw a rise of negative emotions across the entire world by 10 full points. Now think about how much more anger, sadness, stress, worry, and pain that's in the world. If that had been a concomitant 10-point rise in unemployment, we'd all be talking about it. This whole conference would be talking about it. Yet when it's in anger, stress, sadness, pain, and worry, it's almost like it goes totally unnoticed. I mean, of course, not to the people who are feeling it. And now why does that have consequences? Now that we've had all these researchers that talk about behavioral economics, most of the decisions that we make, are they done rationally or are they done emotionally? We're really proud of this, but a little over 10 years ago, we did brain scans and actually asked people certain decisions, and then we could see if what was triggering was an emotional decision or a rational one. So we made an estimate, we did our best work, and we found that only 30% are rational and 70% are emotional. Now, some people disagree with this. In Homo Deus, Yuval Noah Harari says it's actually not 70-30, it's 99.9 of the decisions that we make. So if we are feeling more anger, more stress, more sadness, and more pain, then how about the quality of the decisions that we're making? Is the world getting worse as a result of that? And again, one of the great paradoxes is, yes, there is no better time to be alive in this world than it is today, on most accounts, in most countries. Not all, of course. So why is it that when you look at all of these indicators on wealth, you see sort of this paradox where you see this massive rise in negative emotions? And we need a better answer for it, but if we're going to understand the future better, it would be to unpack not just these traditional economic indicators, but to get to the 70% on how we feel, because that may be what's driving the future as well.
I think we have time, if we go very quickly, for one more question.
So Jason Jang, I'm a financial advisor with Edward Jones, work with certain individuals. I love your comment about inflation. I would like to see the Fed stance on stagflation, number one. And number two, looks like we're having a soft landing. What if we see a big spike in inflation 1 or 2 months down the line? And what is the Fed going to do to combat that?
Okay, so stagflation goes the opposite way of what we normally think of. The economy is overheating, the unemployment rate goes down, but inflation goes up. If you're having recession, the economy cooling, the opposite. The unemployment rate goes up, but at least inflation comes down. Stagflation, they both get worse at the same time. So that's the nightmare, worst party guest that you invited. Who invited that jerk? If you're the central bank, stagflation is the worst thing because there's not an obvious thing of what, there's not an obvious playbook of what you do. Now, tariffs as an example, or rising energy prices because of wars around the world, or things that affect the supply side of the economy, are stagflationary shocks that make both sides worse at the same time. That said, if you called the people in the 1970s on your special time machine and you said, you're the last stagflation we had, give us advice, they would say, what's your inflation rate? 2.5, coming down to 2. 2.5? What's your unemployment rate? About 4%. They'd be like, why are you bothering us? There were times in the 70s when the unemployment rate was literally 8% and inflation was in the 13s. So I don't see any prospect in the near term of stagflation like that, but there's definitely the possibility of both things getting worse at the same time. And there you usually say, well, how long is each side's discrepancy going to last? Do you think it's temporary or do you think it's permanent? And how big is each side? That's the way I think about it.
Unfortunately, we are out of time, but thank you guys so much for joining us, and thank you to our panelists.
Thank you.